Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar. My name is Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And one of the ways we continue to do that is through this online channel, the Voice of Authority. It's a platform for councils to discuss their ambitions and challenges and influences and issues of urgency. And the only issue of urgency on many councils' minds right now is what will happen on the 5th of May. So we're going to be taking a pre-election period break and hoping to get some holiday into. And we're going to be back on the 10th of May with a one-to-one interview with Councillor Diarmuid Ward, who we expect will be Deputy Leader and Executive Member for Housing and Development at the London Borough of Islington. And then on the 12th of May, we have a panel discussion on our sister channel, 3Fox Presents, with the National Association of Construction Frameworks on how public sector procurement is moving towards net zero. You can register for both of those in the chat. And there's a nice link between our discussion on the 12th and the theme today, the circular economy, because arguably you can't get to net zero without a circular economy. The circular economy approach captures two of the highest priorities of growth. Firstly, designing for minimum waste and maximum reuse of resource. And secondly, ensuring that local communities and culture are preserved and benefit from development. So how are different places balancing those aims and how successfully? And a successful economy rests on a flourishing spectrum of employers, and that in turn requires a range of skills and commercial space to thrive. If the market isn't delivering that range, how far can councils go? What role can procurement play? And how can circular city economies ensure that they remain accessible to outlying market towns and districts, as well as to town and city centres? To tackle those questions and more, the team here has worked its socks off to bring you a great panel, and it's a pleasure to introduce to the Voice of Authority today, in alphabetical order, Councillor Matthew Bird, who is Cabinet Member for Sustainability at Lewes District Council, and Dr. Adam Reid, who is President of the Chartered Institution of Wastes Management, and Susan Robbins, who's Corporate Head of Economy and Community at Winchester City Council. Now, make the most of the expertise assembled on your screens, viewers, by firing in your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll address as many of those as we can during the course of the conversation. We welcome your observations in the chat as well, and we've got a few questions for you via the online survey function. You can contribute to the discussion by answering those as they pop up onto your screens over the next hour. So let's get that discussion started by asking, can growth ambitions be matched with climate and social requirements? In other words, is there such a thing as good growth, and what do we mean by that? Susan.
Yes, interesting question. And I think for me, the simple answer is yes, growth and the green agenda needs to complement each other. In 2019, we declared a climate emergency, and the council 6 months later created an action plan which set out its interventions to reduce carbon emissions, looking through engagement, investments, interventions that would be needed to address becoming carbon neutral as an organisation itself, but also as a wider district. And we set a very ambitious target of that being by 2030, so slightly ahead of some other areas. And at the same time, we recognised, and somewhat driven by the fact that the COVID crisis came in, and that naturally changed some people's behaviours and work patterns and priorities, that in fact we needed an economic strategy to sit alongside that carbon neutrality action plan. And so we worked to create a green economic development strategy. And that was very much about seeing how our economy needed to transition into something that was not only carbon neutral, but also actually created co-benefits from things like social justice, more inclusion, health and well-being, resilient places and communities. So I think for us, we definitely see that growth ambitions and the green circular economy go hand in hand. And I think for us, that's something that's reflected in our stakeholder comments as well when we've been undertaking this work. They definitely feel that there needs to be a move away from this green versus growth debate. And actually, we do need to focus on reducing transport emissions, housing, energy, but also creating a sense of a place where we are a green growth place and giving an identity to the Winchester district around that. As you know, there is an anticipated growth in the sector itself with regards to jobs nationally. And we feel that actually if Winchester District were able to just take a 10% share of some of that growth, that could significantly add something like 2,000 jobs to our economy, something like, nearly 300 million in sales. So yes, we definitely feel that there is an opportunity to be had here around that growth agenda, but being a green place too. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. So Matthew, how does that resonate in Lewis? I mean, 2,000 jobs from the green economy. Does that sound like a sort of a fanciful target? Does that sound achievable to you? What's your approach to the sort of balance between growth and sustainability?
Yes, morning, Toby. Morning, everyone. Yeah, a lot of that resonates in Lewis as well. Certainly not fanciful. I think it's a realignment. We need to sort of work out what work out our potential and work out our priorities. I mean, the short answer to your question in terms of growth and aligning it to zero carbon and climate and social requirements is we don't have any choice. I mean, I don't think there's any other answer. I mean, consumption in its state to date has not worked, and I think the only growth we've seen recently is in carbon emissions. We've bounced back from the pandemic, really strongly in terms of more transport, more carbon emissions, more congestion, and at the same time, following COP26, it's really stark that we have those targets to meet 1.5 degrees, and we are going so clearly and so rapidly in the opposite direction at the moment. So I think so much of this it depends on how we define growth. And certainly in Lewis, I think our approach is more about prosperity, and it's more about community wealth. So getting the context right. So, looking at socially productive use of our land, property, our estate, looking at fair employment, making financial power actually work locally, for us. So that's, it's inward growth to a certain extent, but then, hoping to scale that up and to move that outwards. So really looking at sort of more sort of community ownership, more sort of about shopping locally and looking at the environmental and climate limits. And as Susan mentioned, one of the big elephants in the room. Well, it's not just in the room. I mean, it's there honking, it's trumpeting away there, and just and we're ignoring it, which is climate resilience. We have to adapt now. We can't continue to grow in a climate that that brings so many risks and so many vulnerabilities. So I think aside from the carbon reduction and the net zero approach, it's also that the being mindful of the resilience that we build into our local economy and our circular growth.
Thanks, Matthew. Adam, what pieces of the jigsaw are missing from the conversation so far in terms of an understanding of the circular economy and growth?
Well, good morning, and thanks for the invite, Toby. Look, really interesting insights from both Matthew and Susan. So I'll try and just plug a few gaps. I think 500,000 jobs to be created through a circular economy in the UK. So Winchester can have its share. No questions there. Although I would argue, just what does that transition look like? What are we requiring my mum, my neighbour, my school to do differently? What is it the businesses like the one that I work for at Suez have to do differently? I think the transition to circular is bigger than any transition any of us will have ever faced, because the idea is you stop buying stuff. You start buying a service. You don't buy the product. You don't want the packaging. You want it refilled. This idea that you take materials back to the shop, or you send them back when you buy them online, and they get, refurbed, repaired. This is, to my grandparents, perhaps they might have got some of this. They've gone, oh yeah, I can remember when. But actually, the last 50 years, we've been predicated on a society that was called growth, that it was growth by buying, and taxation was all about buying stuff. And I think we've now got to reinvent ourselves a little bit more. But it's also bigger than just circular. And I'm, I'm convinced that a lot of the debates we've been having, even today with the launch of the energy strategy, it's all about decarbonisation, and yet decarbonisation says nothing about one planet living. And we could carry on using the resources of today and stripping the planet bare and meet our decarbonisation target. But in 2050, the planet still wouldn't be habitable because there'd be no resources left for us to share. And I think, therefore that circularity that the circular economy proposes is actually far more important, I would suggest, than decarbonisation long term, albeit decarbonisation is the hot topic right now. And I think often, you've heard about social well-being, community value, prosperity. Fully agree. I think the social value that can come from doing more repair, more reuse, the upskilling of those thousands of people that are currently not in my sector who could be in my sector is fantastic. But where's the biodiversity in all this? Because if we don't keep the planet healthy, then it still doesn't matter what resources we use or don't use or how efficiently we use them. We're just going to run out. So I think you've got to join those dots a little bit better when it comes to what's my policy, what's my priority.
Fantastic, Adam. Thanks very much. Susan, you wanted to come in there, and just before you do, I'm gonna pop a little poll onto the screen for our audience and just get a fix on what their understanding, what your understanding, viewers, is of the circular economy, and just understand a little bit about whether we've explained it well enough for you. And while you respond to that, Susan, and then Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up that very important theme that Adam was talking about around the green infrastructure and the natural environment and biodiversity. And both the Carbon Neutrality Action Plan and our Green Economic Development Strategy fully recognise the vital role that plays. We have a biodiversity action plan, and we weave in the delivery of creating new habitats, ensuring development has biodiversity within it, and biodiversity net gain, etc. So I think in a way we have many different strategies and approaches, and I think for us the Green Economic Development Strategy is a way that's pulling a lot of these threads together. So it is a slightly wider, although it's called a Green Economic Development Strategy, it's very much about things around transport, housing, biodiversity, and it's the opportunity within all of those that needs to be put together. So fully recognise that importance of the natural environment within that. And I think for local communities' point of view, that's the thing that really resonates to them. What's their quality of place like, and the natural environment, particularly in a district like ours, which is very rural. It's got its wonderful city and heritage assets, but it's also got a fantastic natural environment as well.
We're going to come on more and explore some of that about how local authorities specifically can drive towards a circular economy. Matthew.
Yeah, and again, coming back on something that Adam mentioned, and I think it'd be good to use Adam's mum actually to sort of maybe sort of test
our yardstick.
Because I think it's absolutely right, in terms of what it means to people, and I think and it is slightly touching on sort of what we might discuss further with local authorities. But I think with procurement, I mean, we've just got so used to sort of outside sourcing, and it's in all fields, and whether it's those big sort of faceless national procurement companies that do anything and everything, and to some degree, they've stripped some of our assets bare, and so a lot of that, what should be sort of local community wealth has gone outside, and there's nothing circular about it. It's all completely one way. So I think, in terms of that question around, what does it mean to do things differently? I think it is about sort of, keeping that wealth local, and not, it's not doing things necessarily at the lowest possible costs, because, we've seen in the national press from time to time what that means, in terms of sort of quality of service, and in terms of sort of meaningful treatment for employees, and and socially productive businesses. So I think it is about sort of bringing that sort of procurement back in-house to a certain extent.
Thanks, Matthew. Adam, and then we're going to address the audience's reaction as well.
So I might argue with bringing it back in-house, because of course I work for a service provider, but we could also work in partnership, but I think that's where some of the best examples do exist, because our expertise match with local entrepreneurial and interest. But I think the question there was more about value, wealth and cost, And I think, they're not the same, and we know they're not the same, but not everybody agrees with that. And I think sometimes when you're trying to buy a service or an infrastructure or a performance, do you go cheap, or do you go high performance, or do you go for something that's more co-locational, jointly developed? And I think that's the hybrid that I'm interested in, is we don't want to overspend because there is limits, but we do want to deliver additional benefits. And I think the more social value, community cohesion, upskilling, embedding of value that you can do, I think that's where the long-term solutions have to lie.
Well, this is really interesting thread that we can pick up on again very shortly. I just want to rewind very slightly and share the results of our first poll, because quite a lot of our audience, so almost 30% of the audience, it doesn't understand the circular economy very well. So why don't we just go round the panel? I think this is a request from Maya D'Souza, who's watching, and just ask quickly for a definition of what you feel is the circular economy. What's your definition of it? Let's start with Adam.
Good question. So my interpretation of the circular economy is an economy that's predicated on materials that go round and round and round. And that doesn't matter if it's reuse, repair, or recycle, but it's not linear. So you have to think about the long-term life cycle design of the system, the product, the packaging.
Great stuff. Thanks, Adam. Susan?
Very similar. I think I'd very simply talk about it. One person's waste is another person's resource. So I think it's a little bit of a catch that I use, but that's, I suppose, my simple view of it. But I do take the point. It's also about money circulating back around the economy, not just goods and products. That's
lovely and clear. Thanks a lot. Matthew, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that I think it's slightly wider than just materials. So I think it is about keeping the value, whatever value that is, in the local community. So it's thinking about the end of the process as well as the beginning, and making sure that, all that energy and value is sort of, kept locally and kept as part of that process.
Fantastic. That seems really clear to me. Viewers, if you've got any more questions about the kind of definition, then do put them into the Q&A and be as specific as you like, and we'll try and answer them and enlighten. In the meantime, I'm going to launch another question for the audience, just around the skills that we might or might not have in order to realise your definitions of circular economy. And while we do that, let's move the conversation back to what local authorities can do to drive towards it. I think there's this really interesting thread, isn't there, around the procurement process and the acceptance of risk within that, and how far local authorities are willing to go. It seems to me that there needs to be a bit of education, so that outside local authorities and inside, perceptions need to change a little bit to understand what timeframes are involved. So spending a little bit more now over a 50-year period, that can be repaid fairly simply. So we don't need to answer to that extra expense within an election cycle. But no leader wants to be seen as reckless, right? So balancing that need to spend a bit more to invest in some of these new ways of operating, balancing that against the need to achieve value for money. I think that's a real crux that local authorities seem to be facing, and their private sector partners. Matthew, how do you go about that? How do you put into procurement that you don't want best cost, you want best value, and what you mean by that?
Yeah, and it's a big question, and I think going back to Adam's point about when I mentioned in-house, I think we found ourselves in the situation where just over the years got so used to sort of just procuring outside sort of procurement, and I think that has sort of driven things down to its kind of lowest possible level, and with the knock-on impacts. And I suppose what I mean by in-house is not necessarily just in terms of a council, local authority. It's actually within communities. It's actually sort of keeping it. So absolutely, I think there's a big role for partnerships, but it's not that you partner with a company and then all that value just goes outside the area. So I'm absolutely clear that there needs to be sort of mutual benefit. And I think local authorities have a massive role, and and obviously we're against the backdrop of having been stripped of grants and funding and all sorts of issues. So, you know, depending on who you are, it is really tricky. But I think it requires a mindset change. You know, so I think it's I think we got so used to thinking in particular ways, and so used to sort of being courted by, you know, some of these big procurement companies that I've spoken about. It could say, don't worry, we'll come in, we'll take it off your hands. It'll be, you know, no trouble to you. You don't have to do anything. Just do the purchase order. You know, so I think it requires a mindset change. I think it requires, you know, a lot of evidence gathering. So we've worked with Centre for Local Economic Strategies to sort of look at the whole area of community wealth and actually where we can make the most impact. I mean, you know, one example is we've worked with a company called Construction Boutique, who a modular housing company in New Haven in Lewes District. And they train students from East Sussex College, and they've actually built some social housing for us on the site of what was a council building. And I used to be a council officer, and I did the energy audit of that building. And on one side, you'd have people in Hawaiian shirts, and on the other side, you would have people in sort of, you know, full sort of, you know, insulated jackets. Really badly performing building. But now, you know, this local company, you know, we've been able to use our estate to build something that's very energy efficient, use local materials, local design. It's designed a mile away from where it was built, and using council assets. You know, so we've got a couple of other sites in process for that, and then it's using that to scale up to create a procurement framework that we're working with a couple of other local authorities who are also looking at sort of projects locally in Sussex, and trying to do the same thing with timber, for instance. So, you know, we don't have a timber industry really, but we do have a lot of development going on, you know, being planned, that actually, you know, timber would have a sort of co-benefits in terms of, you know, reducing carbon emissions, better woodland management, you know, local training, development. So it's actually sort of using our assets to sort of really fuel that local economy, and you know, and training skills, employment, and answer those ecological and climate emergencies.
Fantastic, thanks, Matthew. Susan, how does Winchester see its role in creating this circular economy and driving towards a more sustainable city? And I guess this is in the context of you've just launched the Central Winchester Regeneration, which is the regeneration of the whole of the city centre as major project, and it's imbued with these sort of themes of sustainability and so on. So you've got the opportunity to realise some of this in a live project. So what's the role of the local authority, do you see?
Yeah, I take Matthew's point around the sort of procurement and using our assets. We also have a housing stock that we can look to retrofit, and I think using assets in that way, that we are taking a leadership role, if you like, and actually trying to demonstrate what can be done. And if we're asking others in the private sector to retrofit and make housing more energy efficient, that we are taking that course as well. We do have procurement policies. We have a sustainable procurement policy, and encourage SMEs and local businesses to participate in our procurement. I think we have a slightly wider role as well. We do, you know, enabling policies around enabling businesses and communities to act. So that's, you know, local plan, and that's setting the development standard. So that is the prime route for then making sure that we have future developments that meet the required and go further than the required standards. Yeah, clearly we have our own areas I've just explained of our own programs of work. Yeah, partnership working vital to make sure that we have some of our key institutions working together. So, for example, we have a city centre partnership of our key institutions where we can share information and learn from each other and mentor each other. Yeah, and we're also taking the role in understanding this more. We do need to perhaps do some research and feasibility on some of these schemes so that we can learn more about what the right interventions are, and also, understanding those technologies, understanding how they can be deployed. I think there is a role for us to share that learning as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Susan. Adam, how do you? What's your experience from the sort of private sector perspective, if you like, as a partner to local authorities?
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing is really positive, and I think as somebody that would bid back to provide some services or some partnership with these authorities, I think the future looks bright. I mean, I'll give you one example. There are a few in recent years, and I think it is all about. I mean, somebody in the audience is talking about procurement specialists being quite key to this, and I absolutely agree, because if you ask the right question, you've got a chance of getting the right answer. If you ask the wrong question, you can never get the right answer. And so, if you take the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, it's a large area, a lot of people, 1 million people, and they've got a massive waste management budget. But under the mayor's leadership, and with some really enlightened some client managers there, they've gone, look, we're letting a very large contract for a large sum of money, but it can't be about rubbish management. It needs to be about bigger issues. So they said, right, we need all those typical waste management functions performed, but what we really want is we want to see reuse and repair. We want to see the circular economy in action, and we want to see money invested in training and schools and education. We want to see you bring in your expertise from other locations around the globe to what we can do in Manchester. We'll give you the feedstock, we'll give you some land, we'll give you the budget, but we need your innovation. So we were set some targets to achieve, but we were given quite a free hand in how we might meet them. So we've set up a reuse hub, which is like the biggest reuse hub in Europe. And it's drawing material from all of the recycling centres across Greater Manchester. And you're taking out all the material that could be repaired or refurbished. We're putting a series of local charities together so they can co-benefit, co-locate, share. Apprenticeship programs running across those. We're now repairing white goods. We're doing carpentry. We're producing new furniture. We're repairing old furniture, but creating new furniture, which I quite like. We're doing work on bikes that are accessible for everybody at zero cost or minor cost. And the idea there is you're taking a lot of material, you're putting it in the right place to do the right thing to it, and then you're redistributing it back to the communities who need it. So not those that can easily afford to go to whichever shop they might choose, but the communities that are struggling with income, and the communities that, broken families, the communities that are living in sheltered accommodation. The list goes on. And so they've joined their waste management agenda with their community agenda and gone, come on, guys, help us make this work. And so, we're putting £300,000 of money into the mayor's charity. We're redistributing thousands of tons of material direct into the housing stock, and we're training hundreds of young apprentices and young offenders and those that are falling out of school early, to give them the basic skills that could ultimately lead to a career in the circular economy. So I think that's just one example where you go, enlightened customer utilizing their power and their assets, and letting us do some innovation and work with them together to come up with a plan that over the next 4 or 5 years is going to transform the way that materials are considered and even thought about, not just handled and managed. So, and there are others around the UK that are doing similar now. So this is the new trend, I would suggest.
That's a terrific project. Matthew, I know you want to come in and say, but just before you do, Adam, what can you tell us about the outcomes from that project? How long has it been running, and what have you actually delivered?
Well, the centre's only really been operational for the last couple of months, and we've not done the official launch with the mayor yet, so it's very early days. But we've already had, I think there's 10,000 tonnes been redistributed in those early months. We've already had the first set of apprentices go through. We've already set up new benchmarks and standards for some of the quality materials, so that we know that the big brands out there are now going to play nicely with us in terms of helping with the redistribution. We've got a website that's helping do click and collect. A lot is happening in a very short space of time. And when you look at how many people will get touched by this service on an annual basis, I think, come back in a year's time, I think the numbers are going to be exceptional.
We'll do that, Adam. Matthew.
That's fantastic to hear. It sounds really, and I'd really like to talk to Adam more about it, because I think I'd love to see sort of more examples of that. One of the issues that we face as a district council is because there's tiers of councils. So, we collect the waste and recycling, but then, obviously sort of county council are in charge of those sites, and we have we obviously have an energy from waste incinerator plant. sort of near us as well. And so I think that linking up with whether it's Veolia, County Council, East Sussex in our case, and the district councils, it's a really sort of quite a complicated path. It's quite hard to navigate sometimes. So, you know, I work quite a lot with there's a lot of community groups. So we have climate hubs, and we have repair cafes, we have you know, library of things, and we have groups who want to set up a sort of, you know, we used to, in fact, we used to have a Flotsam and Jetsam store where we worked with businesses who would bring all those materials and would reuse them, you know, and that stopped about 5 years ago. So none of this is new, but we need to kind of do it at scale, and also, you know, kind of really engage with the community, and that becomes just much trickier when you're going between different tiers of councils. So I think how we kind of navigate that is for me is the key going forward, because there's so much potential. So everybody wants to do the right thing, but it's actually how you make it happen.
Susan, how do you navigate that process? How do you collaborate with other local authorities in order to sort of build scale around this?
Yes, well, we have partnerships and forums and groups that we work together with our county council on a number of topics, and also with our parish councils as well. So we have worked with very closely, just slightly different tack, but for example, on our movement strategy is a shared strategy between the Hampshire County Council and us and the City Council. So, you know, we do work very closely with them. So it's those forums and those platforms where we can have the dialogue to share and develop the practices.
No, good stuff. And in terms of that that balance of, you know, investing now in order to realise the benefits later, how comfortable do you feel as a local authority in Winchester with that concept that, you know, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM? Right, there's that concept that you go with the big guys because they're proven and they have covenant and they're trustworthy, and you won't be seen as reckless by doing so. How do you balance that with this need to employ locally, to support local businesses and economies, and also to innovate?
I think you're talking specifically around our procurement of services coming in.
I guess, but also just encouraging it more widely across the city.
I think we have. Well, I suppose we have partnerships. We have things like the Sustainable Business Network locally here, which is an organisation that supports businesses on this agenda. We have, as I mentioned, we have a sustainable procurement policy. We have a minimum of 10% within our evaluation criteria needs to be around social value and environmental. We also have, as mentioned before, the requirement to consider whether SMEs and local businesses could contract for this work. So it's about how we devise the specification. So it's not just about the policy per se, it's about giving that space to think about how is this specification devised that provides that opportunity, so that it isn't directed just at a single part of the market.
And is there enough enthusiasm for this sort of approach amongst local people, amongst voters in Winchester, that that you're not worried about the exposure of working with companies that perhaps don't have a covenant, haven't been around for very long, are doing something really innovative and interesting and different?
Well, within I suppose it's risk management. I think that is, isn't it? And I think we have to be able to trial. We might need to pilot some things, we might need to test some things. So again, that might be about breaking down some of the larger pieces of work into smaller bits that test and try. And that provides, again, an opportunity for smaller organisations and entrepreneurs to come in at that level, and then we can but then develop up into scale. So as I say, it's about how you devise the opportunity sometimes. And yeah, you have to learn from mistakes or errors and move on, but it's about testing and trialing at an appropriate scale, so that then you have the evidence base or the confidence then to move on to a larger or the next phase of development. And I think that's particularly true with some of the emerging technologies. It can be easy to perhaps jump on something that seems very, very popular or is out there at the moment, but perhaps hasn't got the track record. So I think there's a measured approach as well around adopting many different types of technologies or solutions around this agenda.
Thanks, Susan. Matthew and then Adam.
You know, the one word that sprung to mind when you were talking about the big boys in procurement was Carillion.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there's an example of bigger isn't better, you know, and how inherently risky it can be, you know, to sort of deliver your carbon agenda, even, you know, and your solar energy potential. And then that's undermined by forces completely outside of your control, by, you know, sort of, you know, the sort of the global nature of the business. So, you know, I think actually, you know, in terms of keeping it local, it's less risky, it's more resilient, you know, there's more investment in, you know, shared priorities to some extent. You know, I'm certainly not counting out partnerships with bigger organizations, but I think it's just, you know, it's making it work for you, you know, so I think that's the key thing. So I think where there are those shared mutual aims, then I think it's you know, anything's possible. I mean, we're actually in the middle of, I mean, there's an application just about to come in for, you know, community solar farm, you know, that we're really invested in through a local energy company called Vesco, you know, and we work with them sort of on and off over a number of years, and you know, we started off with a renewable energy grant scheme with them, which was about, I think we invested £20,000 in that, and they delivered nearly £1 million worth of renewable energy installments, and that was, you know, about 10 years ago. So, you know, there is less risk in a sense of sort of like the input versus the output.
And it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the energy strategy that's been announced is all about the sort of, you know, what we're going to be doing in 10 years' time, and building nuclear power stations, which is, I mean, 10 years seems optimistic, given the past track record. But what you're talking about is schemes that you can deliver today that have almost immediate effects, you know, very, very short-term benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, on the energy strategy, I mean, what is also, you know, slightly sort of scary in one sense is that, you know, whilst finally we've woken up to, you know, the security of supply issues and how important that is, you know, if we then answer it with measures like, you know, that fracking has come back on the agenda, against sort of other more potentially contentious issues like onshore wind, then we risk sort of undermining that security of supply issue with, you know, carbon and, you know, environmental issues. So, you know, I mean, we've got to be conscious of all, we've got to have a balanced approach no matter what path we choose, whether it's sort of locally grown or not. It's got to meet a number of objectives.
Thanks, Matthew. And now you've introduced the concept of timescales now. So I'm going to ask the audience about their confidence in the transition to a circular economy, and what period they think that might be achieved in. Adam, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was an interesting point about technologies in the waste sector, particularly. I think we're littered with failures, because they were the next shiny object that was going to solve our residual waste problem. It was going to solve our landfill issue, and nigh on they failed. And the ones that didn't fail were the larger EFWs, which are a traditional bankable technology. They're not the long-term solution, but they.
Sorry, Adam, for the benefit of laymen like myself, EFW,
energy from waste. So you've already heard about one of the plants earlier, but and they are, you know, a bankable technology that's been operating for a long time, and that's the difference. Do you really want to take a risk with local taxpayers' money on a technology that sounds shiny and great and might not deliver? And I think that's you know, that's what you've got to weigh up here, is a local investment on a company that may or may not have the bank balance to back it. And you know, what I would say is, you know, and I wouldn't want to declare this in public too often, but if we've got a contract that's making a loss, we're a big company, we can cope. If you've got a small local company that's making a loss, it's going under, or you're going to bail it out. So we've got to be careful about where you draw the boundaries between what, you know, how you keep the wealth circulating and when actually you're running an inefficient service because, you know, it's inefficient, I suppose.
And in your experience, Adam, looking at your business across the country, what kind of appetite for risk are you sensing? amongst local authorities?
Local authorities want to give us all the risk wherever possible, because the risk of commodity prices changing, recycling rates, and the recycling markets globally have been changing daily. They don't want to take risk on hitting a target. They want to give that risk to us and say, you hit the target, because ultimately that's what they're paying for, is the expertise of us to pull the right lever or to up our game if needs be. More recently, I think you look at the last year or so, you're seeing a much more balanced risk profile, because you're seeing authorities recognizing that if they really want to drive reuse repair, they want to change behavior, you can't farm that out to a third party like us, because we can't control all of that. So you need to do that together. And I think that's where you get the best outcomes, because your local communities better than we'll ever know them, even if we are visiting them twice a week, every week with a lorry of one description or another. And you'll also understand what their priorities are. And I think it's when you put those together, is it community value? Is it keeping the streets clean? Is it a high recycling rate? Is it a circular economy? Is it a repair CAF? It could be any of the above, but if you know what they are, then we can start to deliver them together. And I think that's a common phrase that's coming out here, isn't it? It's collaborative.
Yeah, thanks Adam. Susan, Matthew, I'll give you the right to reply to Adam's comments, but I also want to draw two of the findings from the audience together. So we asked them earlier about whether we have the skills in our sectors to realise the ambitions of a circular economy, and 63% feel that we don't have those skills currently. And then when I asked about timeframes, over half of the audience think it'll take at least 15 years, if not more, and 5% feel that we can never achieve the transition to a circular economy. So I want to ask, firstly, Susan, how optimistic are you about this, and what sort of timeframes would you set around it? And secondly, is that the right link between the skills that we have available to us now and optimism or pessimism over whether we can achieve it?
Well, interestingly, we've set our green economic development strategy over a 10-year period. So I think we're in that sort of middle ground, and the carbon neutrality by 2030. So that's our sort of time frame. We recognise that actually, if you can move some elements further along sooner, that adds to the benefit and adds to the ability to achieve that more quickly. So you almost need to work at pace now, and then that gives you greater advantage in your overall programme. I think skills is a very important aspect, and that is where we are looking to, we have employment and skills plans on our developments, a larger size development, so that's about encouraging apprenticeships and local employment in skills within those developments. So yeah, we definitely see that there is an opportunity to develop up skills, and then that creates local employment, and that all feeds into that circular economy benefit. I was going to just pick up on Adam's point as well about that knowing our communities, and I think for us that working at the community level is really important, because it's about the mentoring and mutual conversation going on within those communities that really drives behaviour change as much as sort of generic campaigns that might come out. So I think that and that keeps the idea of that resilience as well going within that community. So that real local work and local projects is very important aspect.
Great stuff, thanks, Susan. Same question to you, Matthew. And also, I'm going to take the opportunity to start moving the conversation on to our last topic as well, which is how transport waste and power infrastructure can shape sustainable economies. And we've already touched on this to a degree.
I've worked in sustainability and climate change for quite a long time, and I'm surprisingly optimistic, actually. So it's because I do feel that there is a change coming on, because I think obviously the sort of the danger is that the climate is that's moving at pace as well. So whether or not we're in time to avert some of the worst impacts, who knows? But at the same time, I feel that what we've seen recently, with especially using the renewable energy sector as an example, is that we've had inconsistent sort of funding and schemes sort of set up over the years that have kind of built up a whole sort of network of, say, solar companies, and locally we had quite a few, and almost not enough work to meet that demand, and then the kind of the underpinning structures have disappeared. We've had the same with the insulation companies. a lot of energy. The skills and the training and the jobs have just been consistently undermined. So I think there's a lot of sort of underlying issues which need to be addressed, which I feel are starting to be, because the scale of the problem has been sort of ramping up at the same time. But I think the speed at which we saw those companies come into being in the first place really gives me hope that actually, if that support is there, if the engagement with partners, local authorities, local economic partnerships, the government policy is there, that can come about so quickly. And it's and if you look at the wind sector, for instance, where there has been that support, in offshore wind, we've seen now that it's the cheapest form of electricity. And so I think in terms of the decarbonised electricity sector, and where those emissions are highest, we can do so much so quickly.
And you're not short of ambitions either. So there's that huge social housing retrofit project that you've got going. So do you want to just give us a little bit of information about that? Because in addressing the sort of big infrastructure, big ticket items, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that started from a conversation 2.5 years ago. And what we've also managed to do is to get other local authorities interested in that approach. So we have a group called Greater Brighton, which is a partnership of 7 authorities. And so essentially what we're doing is we've taken a sort of a very holistic approach to our social housing sector. So we've looked, again, it's this idea of what can we do with our own estate to kind of catalyze bigger action and to sort of really scale up. And so, we've done the analysis of retrofitting options on our own estate, a real deep dive into what the sort of zero carbon approaches would be. And then using our combined housing revenue budgets across 7 local authorities, how that can really sort of shape that bigger change. And and then in terms of the skills and the training, how we can use that to then sort of get into our local colleges, so into East Sussex College, and train those sort of installers, renewable energy technicians of the future. And so far it's kind of it's early days on the one hand, but we've got really good empirical evidence. We know how much it's going to cost, and we've kind of approached it in a sort of step-by-step fashion. We're absolutely sure that this is the way to kind of answer what to date has been kind of a sort of just a lack of use of our estate, and really, to answer a bit of a shortfall of policy as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Matthew. Right, Adam, very happy for you to pick up on any of the threads that we've got dangling now, but also to address our audience's response to the question: is the government doing enough to make a circular economy happen? And I guess this is tied in with that skills agenda. There's 100% resounding no. What's your ask of government, Adam?
Well, I'm not surprised, because they've spent the last 4 years on policy reform that's all focused on recycling, which is there in the hierarchy, not reuse, not reduce, not prevent. So, we kind of, and then when you start talking about carbon, they start talking about carbon capture and storage, which is, again, right down the low end of it's the technology end of solution, not reduce consumption. So I just kind of think we when it comes to policy, we need more leadership. There's no question about it, because somebody has to explain to my mum that I want her to buy less and to buy stuff that goes round and to refill and repair and to think about long-term usage. That's not the model she's been used to. And COVID forced her to rethink some of her shopping habits. Great. Can I now harness that to now make her more circular? That's the question I'm facing Friday night over the dinner table.
Adam, I don't know if Nikki Gavron knows your mum, but she's asking, making exactly that point on the Q&A. Shouldn't we be including in our definition of a circular economy that what is designed should be designed in such a way that it can be reused, repurposed, recycled? That's the core of this, isn't it?
She's absolutely right. I mean, Nikki's been leading this charge for a very long time in London, of course, and the heart of the circular economy is circular design. If you design correctly, everything else will work. If you don't, if you design to put it on a shelf so it looks nice and gets whipped off and sold, nobody thinks about, can I dismantle it? Can I refill it? Can I repair it? Can I recycle it? That's secondary. And we've got to move the bar so much higher. So it's a long way to go, which is why your time frame question is so interesting. You know, my sector says we could decarbonize by 2040. We've not said we can go circular by 2040. I've got to be honest with you, I don't think we'll be circular by 2040. I don't think the economy will be circular by 2050. Because if you ask Treasury, they don't even talk about the circular economy. They talk about the economy, like the circular bit, the green bit, they're still struggling with. So in reality, I think we'll get closer and closer, but I think you're not going to see major strides until 2035, 2040, because a lot of this, you need more of those Greater Manchester examples, but they take years. And then you also need all the businesses to form around, and that takes even more years. So that's where the skills gap comes in. And I've just put a link in the chat, because that's actually the theme of my presidential year with the Chartered Institute, is focusing on the green skills transition for 2025 to 2035, because we recognize that, as just one example, if every household puts out 2 items for repair annually, just 2, an old iPad, a broken laptop, you know, a printer that doesn't work, you know, the list goes on, it's endless, you know, a deck chair. That's going to generate an economy on its own worth 1.4 billion and employ 40,000 people. But where's the infrastructure to put that in place? Who's driving that agenda? Who's going to employ them? Who's going to train them? We don't have those skills, but the Institute, working with the trade bodies across the sector, is already planning that transition. We're already working on how many repairers do we need? How many people that do quality sort? How many people are we doing behavioural change? You know, how many people won't be working on a landfill site or working in an energy from waste plant in 20 years' time? Absolutely. Let's start transitioning them now into skills that we will need: chemical recycling, you know, greater material designers, people that can influence sustainability, decision making at C-suite level. That's where we need to be influencing.
Where would you like local authorities to plug into that?
Well, so local authorities are going to be a major employer. There's no question about that. But they're also, for me, the major facilitator, because they're still letting large contracts for materials, whether it's residual, recyclables, or reuse and repair. You could let a bundle of contracts that then let us do what we're good at, which is innovate and bring best practice. And I think if you can create a base load for some of my sites, some of my new facilities, some of the new infrastructure, that means I can then go and offer those solutions to industry as well. And then we can bring the commercial waste in, because at the moment, commercial waste recycling is significantly lower than municipal, because it's not targeted in the same way. So if you wanted to do reuse and repair or waste prevention or, you know, decarbonisation in the private sector, unless it's financially driven, it won't happen until we've got spare infrastructure space.
Susan, can Winchester make use of these initiatives?
I'm sure that we could. I think it's very interesting to hear some of the projects that have been discussed this morning. And as I mentioned earlier, we definitely want to learn from others and take that test and trial and understand what works in other areas into our sort of strategy and our carbon plan. I think it's interesting around the skills agenda. We're not the only ones that are tackling this. I know in our area, our WINAC, our Winchester Action on Climate Change, is running a super homes project, and within that, whilst it is focused on housing retrofit, a key element of it is about building up the skills in the businesses to install, mend, repair and look after the retrofit homes. So we're not the only ones, and I think it's about that facilitation. It's not just our own contracts, but it's supporting other agencies and organisations in the area that are doing this and enabling them to build up the skills within the sector as well.
Thanks, Susan. Matthew, I know you wanted to come in on this as well. And also I'm keen to hear what your ask of government is in terms of support for what you're trying to achieve. Yeah,
well, I mean, I think in us from government, I think Adam put it well. I mean, there is a policy vacuum in so many areas. You know, and we've found that obviously with the Environment Act, it took so long to come about and was slightly underwhelming when it did. You know, so I think there's you know, I think it's great. We also have a lot of community projects and facilitated a lot of things. We, you know, Furniture Now, for instance, you know, answering some of those sort of cost of living issues, you know, providing good quality furniture. but we have food banks, and I think whilst we have really, one of the big issues is just cheap goods. It has been over the years. Everything is just so cheap that we've got into this throwaway society. Cheap food, cheap electrics, all the rest of it. We still have food banks, and so I think how we're able to kind of ramp up those kind of circular economy approaches to that kind of scale, to sort of answer the likes of Amazon and stuff being flown over from China or by ship, for 1 pence, something ridiculous, until we can actually sort of answer that at scale, in a meaningful way, then we are just going to be sort of almost tackling a very small part of the problem. So I think we're only going to be sort of engaged with those sort of concerned sort of Greens and people that do think about the net zero agenda. So I think we really need to kind of, as local authorities, just sort of operate in that reality and be very aware that actually, if we want to do something, we're not just sort of just sort of tinkering at the edges, that we are making some really big meaningful change. Yeah,
big meaningful change is required, and that means big meaningful change to culture and behaviour, doesn't it? I'm just going to pop back to Susan, because we haven't heard from you, Susan, on the kind of those big ticket items, that energy specifically, and what Winchester is doing around energy networks, for example.
Yes, well, we are looking at it's almost a community level, and we have been working and doing profiling with each of our local communities under a scheme called We Can, which is very it's a community audits. We've done that in partnership with other agencies to help us undertake that work. But it's getting the community to understand what their opportunities for climate change is and local energy generation. And we've done several bits of action planning around that. And the next stage will then be to take forward what might come from that. We have, of course, been looking at PV and energy generation on our developments and EV infrastructure that goes along with the charging points that we want to put across the district. I think, as I mentioned right at the beginning, we are not only just a city, we're a rural district that's got some fabulous and distinctive market towns within it, and it's about understanding how each of those can develop their own energy so that they're resilient and have their own infrastructure. So I think it's interesting that we talk about at scale, but also we need a distributed way of looking at the energy generation and storage as well as at scale in different locations.
So it's about doing it locally. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, we're almost out of time. Adam, I'm gonna leave you with the last word. I think we've got something very specific around energy for waste. So there's an outstanding question from Nikki Gavron. I don't know if you want to sort of go back to that and talk a little bit about the carbon intensiveness of that energy for waste program, but also what is the art of the possible in terms of the kind of cultural and behavioural change that's needed. So we're great schemes like Susan and Matthew have talked about that they're implementing locally, but there's a much broader change that's required, isn't there?
Yeah. So on the energy from waste and carbon intensity, I mean, Nikki's right. Burning stuff, particularly stuff that's got fossil fuel content, plastics and organics, for example, will generate as much carbon as it saves. And so, it's not a long-term solution, but those materials in a landfill site are worse. And so the energy from waste portfolio grew over the last 20 years to deal with our, move material away from landfill. Now we're going into a take plastics and take organics out of EFW. EFW becomes less critical, smaller scale or less sites dealing with a true residual waste, not hampering recycling at all. So I feel comfortable that with carbon capture, utilization and storage on the back end of the smaller number of plants in the future, they will be part of the decarbonisation agenda for UK PLC, and I'm quite comfortable with them as part of the portfolio, but not a growing part at all. Your question about the art of the possible, I mean, I think there are great examples already of what can be achieved by thinking about local value, local wealth, community well-being, by building biodiversity and green economy into local procurement. And whether you're buying energy infrastructure, waste infrastructure, or whether you're moving up the hierarchy and going reuse, repair, recycle, the opportunities are there, but you need to ask those questions early about what is it we really want. And I think you need people with a slightly different mindset. I've been in the industry 25 years. People would say that I've got a mindset. I'm not entrepreneurial enough. The young whippersnappers that are coming in now, I've got a very different view of how you balance the triple bottom economy. In terms of getting sustainability to really work. They get it far more than my generation. And I think therefore, let's hope we can get the right advice to the right decision makers who over the next 5 years will be making some fundamental decisions that will change the infrastructure, the services and the value that our society needs and sees. And if they make the right decisions, I will be far more optimistic than if they make the wrong decisions. So fingers crossed.
Fantastic. Fingers crossed. Oh, well, that's a fairly appropriate phrase to end the session on. Viewers, please join me in thanking our brilliant panel for sparing their valuable time and to share their knowledge and experience with us today. Thank you, Councillor Matthew Bird from Lewes District Council. Thank you, Dr. Adam Reed from the Chartered Institution of Waste Management. And thank you to Susan Robbins from Winchester City Council. And most of all, as ever, viewers, thank you for again tuning in and gracing us with your attention and fueling the conversation with some really good questions and poll responses. There are a couple left hanging. I think if you join our LinkedIn members club, then you can find responses from panels circulated there over coming days. Now, don't forget, we're going to be back on the 10th of May with Councillor Diarmuid Ward from the London Borough of Islington, and then on the 12th with the National Association of Construction Frameworks and special guests to discuss how public sector procurement is moving towards net zero. There seems to be some ongoing themes that we're recording at the moment. You can register for both of those sessions in the chat right now. But meanwhile, until then, from our fabulous panel, from me and from everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.